Good evening, everybody. Welcome to everybody joining, quite a large number of people joining our Zoom sphere right now, whether you're local to Manhattan or from far afield. It's great that everybody could be here. My name's Andrew Morrill, and together with my co-organizer of this event and colleague, Professor Deborah Crone, I'd like to welcome you to the BGC seminar in Renaissance and Early Modern Visual and Material Culture. When we first planned this event, I think over a year ago now, we did think naively that we'd be able to have this in person at West 86th Street. And though there's a loss to sociability, I think everyone who's been working via Zoom knows the advantages that such events can now allow a much wider geographically dispersed audience. And for all that we're in a virtual space this evening, I want nonetheless to acknowledge that the land BGC stands on at West 86th Street stands within the Lenape Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Deni Lenape. And in doing so, to call attention to the historical and ongoing realities of colonial dispossession. And we do so in seeking knowledge about the past, the work that we do here. We do so in the context of striving for critical understanding of our present and of our presence here. And so I'm really delighted this evening to introduce our two speakers. Both talks are discrete in subject matter and in the questions they pose, but both are concerned with the early modern European encounter with the Americas, as well as with the materiality of books and prints. And it's the great hope that the juxtaposition will engender very interesting discussion afterwards. So I will now introduce both before handing them over, and then Deborah, as Laura said, will moderate the discussion. So our first speaker tonight is Lia Markey. Dr. Markey is the director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at Chicago Newberry Library. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago and went on to postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, Itati, and the Metropolitan Museum of New York. She's taught at Northwestern University before taking up her current position at the Newberry. And she also teaches in the art history department at the University of Chicago. At the heart of her research is the cross-cultural exchange between Italy and the Americas in the 16th and 17th century, I think seen especially through the lens of collecting history and of early modern prints and drawings. Among her numerous publications, articles, exhibition-related publications, I will mention her 2016 book, Imagining the Americas in Medici, Florence, published by Penn State University Press, that was received with great critical acclaim. This has been followed in 2017 by a co-edited volume, The New World in Early Modern Italy, 1492 to 1750. And her most recently edited volume is Renaissance Invention. I have it here. Stradamus's Nova Reperta, that was made as a kind of accompaniment to the Newberry's for 2020 exhibition of the same title, and which alas got a little disrupted by COVID. And talk tonight is entitled Ethnography and Materiality in Dudley's Arcano del Mare, 1646 to 1547. Before she begins, I'll just introduce our second speaker, Stephanie Porras, who is Associate Professor of Art History at Tulane University in New Orleans. She received her PhD at the Courtauld Institute in London University and has taught there at London University College and at Columbia University. She's currently chair of the Newcomb Art Department at Tulane and is reviews editor designate of the Art Bulletin. Dr. Porras is the author of Peter Bruegel's Historical Imagination, published by Penn State University Press in 2016, and more recently, Art of the Northern Renaissance in 2018. She was co-editor of The Young Dürer, Drawing the Figure at the Courtauld in 2013, and part of the Courtauld books online, Picturing the Netherlandish Canon. Her current book project is called The First Viral Images, Merton de Vos, Antwerp Print and the Early Modern Globe, which traces a group of works from Antwerp across the globe as they were copied and adapted by a host of artists and craftsmen in in far-flung areas of the globe. Her talk is entitled Foul Biting, or Diego Valadés and the Medium of Print. So with that, I'll turn over the screen to Lia with her talk Ethnography and Materiality in Dudley's Arcano del Mare. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Deborah and Andrew, for the invitation, and to Laura for facilitating it all this evening. I feel honored to be presenting alongside Stephanie. And thank you all for being here. I know many of you have heard me speak about this before, or I've even had the opportunity to show you this book at the Newberry, so I'm excited to talk to you. And I will just begin. So Robert Dudley's Del Arcano del Mare, Secrets of the Sea, is an enormous sea atlas published in 1646-47 in Florence. I've been studying it for some time because it includes a substantial section that describes and illustrates a journey to South America on behalf of the Medici in 1608, as well as Dudley's own travels there in the 1590s. So the story of Dudley's Images of the Americas is in the atlas, therefore acts as a sequel to my 2016 book, Imagining the Americas. I recently completed an essay about how Dudley conveys credibility with respect to his outdated knowledge of this distant land in various ways through text and image. Ultimately, I argue that Dudley produced these particular maps and the related texts in the atlas to connect his own geographical knowledge to the Medici dynasty's imperial aspirations, and to help promote the production of the atlas itself. I should show you a few more images here. Here's the frontispiece. And here is one of the maps I'll be talking about in more detail. Dudley's self-assertion, decades after his experience in the region, reveals a desperate desire to insert his own story and that of the Medici into a growing discourse on South America in print and cartography in the early 17th century. So in today's talk, I'll probe further into the material evidence connected to the atlas. I'll first introduce the little study Dudley and the atlas itself, examining an edition at the Newberry, another two at the New York Public Library, as well as related letters about it. Then I will define how the representation of South America stands out from the rest of the maps in the atlas and consider the impetus for their production at this time. Finally, I will dive into Dudley's unstudied preparatory drawings for the atlas that are now in Munich. And I have to admit that due to the pandemic, I have not seen this manuscript in person, and therefore I'll be relying on some old black and white photographs available on the library website. But the drawings for the atlas and their corresponding texts provide new evidence for the significance of the ethnographic images of South America within this large and time-consuming book project. So who is Robert Dudley? He's a cartographer who lived in England and Italy and traveled the globe. He was the illegitimate son of the more famous Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth. And after being educated at Christ Church, Oxford, the young Dudley married Margaret Cavendish, and through her family was introduced to the world of navigation and exploration. And I should note, this is not the more famous Margaret Cavendish who wrote The Blazing World. And I don't think there's any connection to her, but what's interesting about this Margaret Cavendish is she is the cousin of the navigator Thomas Cavendish, who successfully circumnavigated the globe in the late 1580s. And her sister was actually married to Richard Hakluyt. So this was important to Dudley. So Dudley, inspired essentially by these relatives, went to sea with the ambition of circumnavigating the globe. And some sources describe Dudley as a pirate, while other accounts record his travels on behalf of Queen Elizabeth. He ultimately spent several years in the mid-1590s exploring the West Indies and South America. He returned to England to find his wife dead. He remarried and began the process of seeking legitimacy. After it was denied, he left his family in England, and in 1606, he moved to Florence to serve Grand Duke Ferdinando I and then Cosimo II. So this so-called exile was his most stable and productive period. He converted to Catholicism, he married his cousin, whom he actually moved with him to Florence, clandestinely disguised as a page. And in Florence, he devoted himself to shipbuilding at the Medici port of Livorno, to advising the Medici on their seafaring activities, and to the writing of his Arcano, which is really his only major publication. Then following Cosimo II's death in 1608, Dudley acted as chamberlain to Maria Maddalena of Austria and Christine of Lorraine, who were the regents of the young Ferdinando II, the future Medici Duke. So all this is to say that Dudley went from being an illegitimate son in England to rise up through the ranks of the Medici administration to hold a significant position at court. So Dudley began writing and producing drawings for the Arcano long before his move to Florence. A letter recently discovered by the Medici Archive Project, dated to 1607, to Dudley from Ferdinando's secretary, Belisario di Francesco Vinta, thanks Dudley for sending his new book. And it states specifically, Captain Robert Elliot presented the book to me, and because it came from your ingenious hand, I wanted to sample it with the view of those drawings and with the interpretation and the report that I received in many of its parts. I am since then of the opinion, and I judge that this is a rare work and one that needs to be held in the greatest esteem for its discipline and for the maritime arts. And I'm keeping it here with me so that I might enjoy it fully. This obsequious letter makes clear that the manuscript is more or less complete already in 1607. And here the secretary mentions Dudley's drawings and interpretation. He also states that it is a rare work that demonstrates great knowledge of the discipline, which must mean map making, and of the maritime arts, putting the court at an advantage. Already the book is highly prized and well known in the early 17th century. So this letter is revelatory about the reception and dating of the atlas because it makes clear that parts of it were in circulation as early as 1607. And it's quite likely that this rare work that Vinta references in the letter forms part of Dudley's large-scale 3-volume manuscript today located in Munich. Some 700 pages of manuscript in Dudley's hand are loosely organized by continent in 3 volumes. The pages essentially act as a rough draft, including edits for final printed maps. And the frontispiece of one of the volumes, Dudley actually describes it as his quaderno, or his notebook, which I think is very sweet. Multiple images of the same map are included with different explanatory texts and with various levels of completion, revealing a work in progress composed over a substantial period of time. The immensity of the project itself is attested to by this robust and complicated manuscript, which helps to explain why it took some 40 years to complete the printed book. And I'll return to the manuscript in Munich at the end of the talk. A letter in the Newberry's collection, dated 1643, also provides evidence for why the book took so long to come to fruition. Dudley writes to one of Duke Ferdinando II's chamberlains, Benedetto Guerini, and explains multiple problems with the publication. First, there are paper shortages. While he doesn't go into detail here on this issue, the reason for the paper shortage might have been due to the plague, which is something we can relate to today. Then Dudley complains of the slowness of the Florentine publisher and of the Florentine engraver Anton Francesco Lucchini, who writes elsewhere that he spent 12 years producing the engravings for the atlas. Finally, Dudley also gripes that the publisher would not allow the proofreader, with the help of his friend Evangelista Torricelli, who he cites as his friend, you can see mio amico here, to correct the text. So the emphasis on the many important contributors to the project, particularly Galileo's student Torricelli, who he calls mio amico, as translator, makes clear the great value and importance of the atlas, while the need for more paper emphasizes its immensity. The final printed text of the Arcano is composed of several volumes. In the case of the Newberry's edition, each volume is of a different size. The 1646-47 edition was collated in various ways, so that some versions of the text are comprised of 3 volumes and some are 4. And a second posthumous edition of the book from 1661 is composed of 2 or 3 volumes with a few additional prints. The Newberry's 3-volume 1646 edition is composed of 1 volume on longitude with instruments, including numerous dials with volvels that you can see here. These are essentially layered rotating dials and other diagrams with movable parts. another section devoted to fold-out portolan charts of the world, while yet another includes fold-out plans of ships, battle formations on water, arsenals, and fortresses, reflecting Dudley's work in Livorno for the Medici. Volume 2 includes many more instruments and is focused on the art of navigation. Finally, some 131 maps make up the enormous Volume 3 of the Arcano, and here's an image that gives you a sense of its scale. Evaluation of two 1661 editions of the New York Public Library books in comparison with our Newberry edition shows that Dudley's books were customized, meaning that the editions were bound slightly differently based on the interests of the patron or bookseller. And while this is quite common practice in the 16th and 17th centuries, such variations in books of this size and importance can be revelatory about their reception and use. For example, one of the New York Public Library books is in 2 volumes and the other is in 3 volumes. And the plates with instruments and maps were also set in differently in both editions, indicating that the order of the maps was significant to the owner. And you can get a sense of that here in these pictures. You can see that actually the instruments were set in completely differently in the different volumes, and the order of the maps was varied greatly. And one of the 1661 editions has a completely different frontispiece and dedicatory line to Venice, replacing the Medici dedication and announcing a different audience. And I'm still trying to figure out more about this. So returning to the Newberry edition, there are 58 maps of Europe, 32 of the Americas, 17 of Africa, and 22 of Asia in this 3rd volume. Explanatory texts accompany all the images and provide details about the coordinates of the port towns, as well as descriptions of the nature and trade activities of the region. Many of the maps reference climate and terrain, and overall they are simple maps of the coastlines, engraved with elaborate calligraphy. The fact that the majority of the maps represent the Americas is significant, and I'm just showing you here one of the maps of New Spain to give you a sense of the focus truly on the coastline. You have here Tenochtitlan, a volcano, but really the focus, the rest of the space is white, and the focus is truly on the coastline and naming the different areas there. And here's a page of text from the section on Asia. So of the 32 maps of the Americas in the published atlas, the majority represent South America. Within that grouping, 2 double-page plates that Dudley labels as 13 and 14 are different from the other maps in the atlas for at least 4 reasons. First of all, they don't have titles. All the other maps have prominent titles. Second, they are the only maps with dedications, prominent, huge cartouches with the Medici referenced. Third, they are the only maps with figures. And fourth, they include many more ships and monsters than the other maps. So these discrepancies and additions illuminate how much more effort was put into these maps of South America in comparison with the other maps in the volume. And the other maps in the atlas have, you'll see here, titles and cartouches, but no dedications, and they're labeled, the locations are prominently labeled. So I'm just showing you 2 European maps. And here's Sardinia as another example. So let's look closely at these 2 maps. Map 13 represents Trinidad and the Orinoco Delta, which is modern-day Venezuela and Guyana. An elaborate cartouche sits prominently at the base of the page. Native figures and an armadillo flank the cartouche, adorned with the Medici coat of arms, and is inscribed with the dedication to Ferdinando II. So here, Dudley, moreover, refers to himself as the Duke of Northumberland, a title bestowed upon him by the Medici. The natives, dressed sparingly and equipped with baskets, bows, and arrows, occupy a rough spit of land. One woman carries a vessel and a child on her hip, another, perhaps an adolescent, strides, carrying a basket and bow. And beside the depiction of these peaceful indigenous people, a contradictory label states the Iwapanami are cruel people, genti crudeli, indicating some sort of firsthand knowledge. The map itself is detailed with each island, including two called Dudleyano or Dudleyana, clearly named after himself. Dudley has also inscribed the tribal names of the people who live along the coast. He says here, questi sono I nomi delle genti. Two large canoes carry a crowned indigenous figure and Europeans. So the commentary on the indigenous people, the Dudley Islands, the labeling of all the natives, and the depiction of the Europeans in the boats convey the idea that he knew this space. You almost get the sense that he's in one of these boats. In map 14, Dudley represents the mouth of the Amazon in what is modern-day Brazil. Here again, Dudley names the people who live along the coast and includes illustrations of figures of indigenous people. The tattooed native couple holds weapons. She holds a bow and arrow, while he, festooned with a feather crown, holds a tupinamba club and spear. The tupinamba club with the blunted head appears to derive from an actual club from the region of northeast Brazil. As Amy Buono has pointed out, it's nothing like the club represented in the famed Stradamus print of America. It's actually much more accurate to the region. So such ethnographic details in the Dudley map could demonstrate, actual experience with the weapons of the region depicted on the map. And then to the right, perched on la linea equinoziale, is the native jaguar, not quite as accurate as the Tupi Club. A caption on this map, here actually in the crease in our edition, states simply, guardatevi qui da una bornia nel flusso dopo la mezzanotte, which I'm translating as watch out here for a tidal wave or something similar after midnight. So image and text here convey specialized knowledge of the region only acquired through familiarity and experience as a navigator. And Dudley defines the significance of these two maps in the corresponding text, explaining map 13 represents parts of the coast of Guyana that he discovered. Here's the text. And he actually states here explicitly that the area was discovered by the author, fu scoperta dall'autore. He further explains that a related map appeared in a Portolan chart already in 1595. And here even references another map that is included in the volume of one of these of the same book. Dudley's text here is much more personal than in other sections of the book describing other maps. While the description of the other maps of the other regions of the world define the coordinates of the locations represented and describe mercantile activities, they do not discuss in depth the nature of the inhabitants. Here in relation to the maps, he goes on to describe the land, the climate, the people he experienced, and often in an unfavorable light, relating bad air that made his shipmates ill and the natives as cattivissime, or very bad and untrustworthy. He describes them as cannibals who eat human flesh. He writes that map 14 represents the area explored by the English captain Robert Dudley for Ferdinando I and under the instruction of Dudley himself, explaining that Thornton returned safely in the end of June 1609 with his entire crew as well as 6 natives, also cannibals. Only one of the natives survived in Florence, but he recounted to Dudley about the fertility and richness of the reign of Guyana, describing the cities, the mines, the sugar, the spices, the silkworms, the cotton, and the other commerce they produced, as well as the dangers of certain regions. So Dudley's corresponding texts, at times degrading the indigenous people, read in stark contrast to his reference to the surviving native at the court, the images on the map, and other texts in the volume that aim to record and even conserve the culture. For instance, Dudley also includes in this section a detailed dictionary of the Indian language of Guyana and of the island of Trinidad that he learned during his stay there in 1595. He actually says, observed by the author in 1595. The vocabulary here cited ranges from body parts to food items and animals, and Dudley's excessive inclusion of information about the area and the frequent reiteration of the term dell'autore conveys a desperate need to convey authority, when in fact the Arcano was obsolete by 1646, its publication, and the Medici power in the area non-existent. So why is Dudley writing this at this time? in the 17th century and highlighting South America. How are his maps and texts different from others? What sources is he using? Who is vying for control over South America? The Arcano comes out in the midst of a flurry of publications about travels to South America, particularly in England, France, and the Netherlands. Beginning in the late 1580s and peaking in 1648 with William Piso's publication, The Historia Naturalis Brasileira, for Juan Maritz, a comprehensive study of the flora, fauna, and people of Brazil. Dudley had already published the description of his journey in a 1599 edition of Hakluyt, and William Davies, a barber surgeon who traveled on the Medici voyage under John Thornton, published a narrative about their journey in 1614. In the 1580s, texts by André Tevet and Jean de Lery described and illustrated Brazil, and in the 1590s, Theodore de Bry's volumes illustrating and describing the voyages of Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake circulated throughout Europe as well. So while the Treaty of Tordesillas effectively gave much of Brazil to Portugal as early as 1494, France, the Netherlands, and the Medici vied for a piece of the region rich in natural resources in the last years of the 16th century and first years of the 17th century. And Dudley surely knew the long tradition of mapping and representing South America in the late 16th century and wished to insert his knowledge about the region and the people into this growing visual corpus. So here I'm just showing you a map of Brazil produced by Munster in 1540, at which, if you can look closely, you see Canibali here represented. You see some limbs coming out of some Brazil wood there. And Sarika Davies' study of 16th century French maps of Brazil traces a consistent visual trope of cannibalism. Yet she explains that cannibalism was never presented as the most important aspect of Tupi life or of European encounters with the Tupi. And in Dudley's atlas, the image of the cannibal is missing, while the textual description remains. Dudley's maps recall some 16th century sources about the region, but the truth is they're quite unique. So if we compare to some images of South Americans in debris, that you see some connections with the headdress. And he clearly knew Hondius, this map, which was made following Lawrence Keymis's design after Walter Raleigh's second journey in 1596, but he deviates substantially from this source as well. In this case, contrary to Dudley's map, the natives are depicted as monsters called blemmies, recalling the Ewapanomi that he cites, while the textual description in the cartouche in the Hondius describes them in a favorable light. The similarities between Dudley's maps and images of the Piso book are most striking. Dudley's awkwardly rendered jaguar looks to be a close relative of the Piso jaguar, while Dudley's indigenous figures like Piso's carry similar arrows and are also comprised of family groupings. Yet Dudley's bodies are represented on maps and not within the text, as is the case with Piso. While the figures are tied to Dudley's descriptive texts on the pages surrounding the maps, they are cartographic bodies tied to the land. Bodies are prevalent in early modern maps, so Dudley's inclusion here is not unusual. In her seminal essay, Mapping the Global Body, Valerie Traub, quote, proposes that what seems to be a superfluous aesthetic convention of putting bodies on maps conveys a strategy of spatialization that brings significantly new ethnographic, racial, and gendered relations of knowledge into view. Traub shows that the so-called cartographic body helped to make nations in the early modern period, and in so doing, quote, reframed nationality as implicitly gendered and erotic, as well as an incipiently racial phenomenon, unquote. Indeed, many early modern maps and atlas frontispieces represent female allegories of the continents or use the female body to represent place. These bodies are often racially distinct through color, dress, and body type. While different races emphasize through dress and tattoos in Dudley's maps, these figures do not represent place in an allegorical mode as described by Traub. Dudley's family groupings, more reminiscent of the figures in Piso, recall what Stephanie Leach calls the, quote, ethnographic impulse, a pictorial turn that reveals early incidents of visual accuracy and unprecedented investment in the practice of ethnography. Leach discusses Berkmeyer's early 16th century friezes representing natives of the world as maps. They show heterosexual families, units of different races engaged in activities described in travel writing. Dudley's depictions are thus coming out of a long tradition of representing families in prints and on maps. The couples and family groupings further bring a sense of eyewitness legitimacy to the map, and in this way could allow the European viewer to relate to the indigenous figure. A contradiction, however, remains between the description of the indigenous as cattivissimi and crudeli, cannibals, and the familial groupings evoking empathy from the viewer. Ultimately, the Arcano's two detailed South American maps reveal an attempt to show knowledge over a region Dudley only explored briefly and that the Medici failed to experience substantially. And here I should expand a little bit with some background information about the Medici's attempted incursions in South America. By the early 17th century, Duke Ferdinando de' Medici evidently began to consider the idea of creating a commercial enterprise in the Americas and was eager to arm himself with as much information as possible. In August 1601, he received a notice about regional mining from an engineer working in Brazil and pursued information on this possibility for many months. Then in 1608, Ferdinando sends out Thornton's group to the region of the Amazon. And this is just one of many letters that documents, sorry about the noise here. Ultimately, we've considered procuring some part of New Spain or the coast of Brazil, and now just having learned of news about a place on the coast of Brazil under the crown of Portugal called the Espírito Santo, and under the perpetual domain of certain Portuguese, we gladly negotiate with them because they say it is a large country to acquire and with good air. It would be enough to have the license to send 2 ships per year for many years. So this is just one example of a letter documenting their attempts to gain access or gain control over the region. There's also quite a bit of evidence about their interest in sugar. And when I don't have time to go into detail, I just wanted to remind you of Stradamus's sugar print to evoke this interest in sugar refinery at this time in Medici, Florence. But Dudley's maps are ultimately dedicated to Ferdinando's grandson, Ferdinando II, and they were printed during his reign. So by the time Ferdinando II was in power in 1621, there was little interest in the Americas. Ferdinando was the patron of Galileo, and his interests focused on science and technology. And Dudley's pointed mention then of Torricelli as mio amico in the 1643 letter was certainly meant to connect himself to that Duke circle. So as I move toward a conclusion, I'd like to reflect a bit more on chronology in relation to these 2 South American maps in the Arcano, and to return to Munich drawings. The letter from the Medici secretary presented at the start of the talk indicates that the manuscript was already near completion in 1607, and Dudley references in the Arcano a 1595 map of the region that he produced. Yet the Arcano comes out decades later in 1646, and Dudley himself writes twice in the Arcano that he had map 13 of South America printed in Florence in 1637 with a dedication to Ferdinando II. So this very pointed explanation paired with the elaborate cartouches with the dedications and the lack of titles could indicate that these 2 maps were produced as single sheet prints preceding the publication of the Arcano to promote both Dudley and the Medici activities in South America. So the drawings in Munich reveal early thoughts for these maps and their development into more elaborate showpieces. Already in manuscript form, the maps of the region include substantially more detail and text than any other maps in the manuscript volume. So there are 3 drafts of the map of Guyana. One set was produced with simple line drawings, and the others have a little bit of watercolor, a little bit more detail. The figures are not represented in these drawn sheets, but the preliminary line drawing includes a faint cartouche here. indicating a plan for the inclusion of the Medici dedication. And as I mentioned earlier, the only figures represented in all of the printed maps are in the atlas are in the South America maps. So the drawn album, on the other hand, includes numerous bodies. I'm just showing you a few examples of mermaids, mermen, female allegories, but the prominent figures that we see in the printed South American maps are completely lacking. So I'm really wondering why there's this absence. Is it because he's relying on his printmaker later on to produce these images? Instead of figures and animals here, the pages are filled with text that didn't make it into the final edition. Some texts are quite long and extensive. I've been trying to look at the differences between the text and the manuscript and the printed edition. So actually here's the phrase that io appanami sono genti crudeli, and here he adds deformi. So in an earlier edition, he cites them as being deformed. And I'm sorry, I don't have better images. I'm working on it. Here he is a long passage where he describes Thornton's trip on behalf of the Medici, and he cites himself over and over again as well. And what's wonderful too is in the manuscript, you can see his edits, you can see his train of thought, and perhaps a little bit of self-censorship as well. So I'm hoping to see the real manuscript sometime soon. So the production of the South American maps and then inclusion decades later in the Arcano demonstrates that the Americas continue to live on in the Medici imagination long after 1608. It's likely that these engravings were used in order to promote Dudley's project and to secure funding for this expensive book for the Medici. Both the Medici investment in South America and Dudley's publication were fraught and slow to develop. These South American maps foster, quote, a Medici empire that wasn't, to borrow Brian Brege's term. The Brazil maps and their corresponding text endeavor to endow Dudley's book with believable knowledge about a distant, desirable region, abounding with natural resources and yet replete with danger and uncertainty. The racially distinct indigenous figures and their family groupings holding weapons from the region further function to provide Dudley with credibility about the area and its people. Dudley's authority was meant to make the Medici dedicatee as omniscient as possible in a far-flung part of the world that he knew through travels that took place decades long before the 1646 publication. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was wonderful, very rich, full of, I have lots of questions. I'm sure many of our vast audience does as well, but we are not going to take them now. We're going to move right on to Stephanie's talk. So Stephanie, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah and Andrew, for inviting me and Leah to speak tonight. And thanks, Leah, for her excellent paper. And I know there's a number of points of inflection and reflection here as we move sort of back in time into a different geography. On the 10th of May, 1577, Philip II sent a letter via the Spanish ambassador in Rome requesting that Diego Valadés immediately vacate his post as the Procurator General for the Franciscan order in New Spain and leave Rome for, quote, the many things he had done, end quote. This cryptic royal order for Valadés's deposition and exile was so sudden that it interrupted the printing of the Franciscans' rhetorical treatise, the Rhetorica Christiana. Apparently, Valadés had been at work on the text for some time. 204 pages had already been printed when he fled Rome, but the book would only be completed in the papal city of Perugia, the city to which the chastened Valadés retreated. The text is based on classical sources on the Ars Memorativa and specifically cites Aristotle, Cicero, Quintilian, and the unknown Roman author of Ad Herennium. But the Rhetorica Christiana is best known today for its illustrations as the first published text on the evangelization of indigenous Americans to show Christian rhetoric in action across the Atlantic. The book's 27 prints depict not only mnemonic alphabets and instruments of memory, but also portray the customs of the inhabitants of New Spain, where the author had himself worked as a missionary. scholars since the end of the 17th century have presumed that Valadés was himself a mestizo, that is, of mixed indigenous American and European parentage, thus both a product and an observer of Spanish conquest and conversion. The images of New Spain included in the Retórica Cristiana and Valadés's twin authority as mestizo and missionary have undergirded previous scholarship on this volume. The images themselves, however, have not received focused art historical attention as objects. Indeed, in the many books, articles, and dissertations written by art historians, historians of colonial Latin America, and literary scholars on the Retórica, the prints are invariably described as engravings. No one has in fact noted the fact that many of these prints are the result of etching, the process by which a copper plate is exposed to the biting of an acid solution rather than engraved with a burin. To some, this might seem like a minor error, the quibble of a connoisseur, but this persistent miscategorization exemplifies a systemic failure to account for the particular production history of the Retórica and its ambition as a printed product. Indeed, too often the book's status in the study of early modern print is that of exotica, the prints used as icons of missionary and/or mestizo experience. That is, an insistent focus on the ethnic status of its supposedly mestizo author, the excavation and parsing of the book's various indigenous and European reference, have obscured a much more complex story about how the text was published and how it came to be illustrated. Tonight, I would like to reposition the Retórica within a larger network of transatlantic knowledge production and print culture. Reassessing the facture and ambition of the Retórica's prints, this talk explores the epistemological and ontological operations of print in mediating transatlantic experience. I will argue that the etched line and the foul bite, as evidence of the print's singular facture beyond its indexicality, suggests how a rematerialized study of this book moves beyond the binary of mestizaje. The assumption that Diego Valadés was a mestizo originates in the late 17th century, when Agustín de Betancourt in his Teatro Mexicano identified him as a natural de Tlaxcala, a claim repeated by the art historian Francisco de la Maza in his foundational 1945 study of Valadés. De la Maza dubbed the Franciscan the first mestizo author to publish a book in Europe. But Spanish scholars since the late 1980s have offered compelling archival evidence that Diego Valadés was in fact born in Extremadura, in Spain, one of 8 children born to a Bartolomé Valadés, before the entire family moved to New Spain. Indeed, even in 1650, 50 years before Betancourt's history was published, Luke Wadding, the Irish Franciscan historian, had referred to Valadés as Hispanus. The Retórica's own preface uses this term, Hispanus, for the author, rather than Mexicanus. Within the text, rather than identifying with indigenous subjects, Valadés claims that those born in the Americas were, quote, ignorant for being born in such a burdensome climate, yet in the same sentence he praises their designs, calendars, and pictorial histories. A childhood move to the Americas fits with Valadés's own statement in the Retórica that he had, quote, dedicated myself for more than 22 years to preaching and confessing them in 3 of their languages, Nahuatl, Tarascan, and Otomí. And yet, despite this evidence and Anglophone and much Mexican scholarship, Valadés is still invariably treated as a mestizo subject, author, and artist. While it appears unlikely then that Valadés was actually born in New Spain, he did spend the majority of his life in the Americas. It was where he was educated and formed his ambitions as a missionary and an author. He likely joined the Franciscan order in Mexico around 1555 at the Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco. Valadés mentions that he worked as a missionary amongst the Chichimecs north of Mexico City, in a region prone to rebellion against Spanish rule. But by 1572, the Franciscan was in Spain. Valadés had been sent to Europe in order to represent the Mexican church to the newly elected head of the Franciscan order, and he immediately proceeded to France in order to make this meeting. But by the following year, Valadés was back in Spain, reporting to the president of the Council of the Indies and to the Spanish head of the Franciscan order. In addition to his official business in Europe, Valadés immediately pursued the publication of a book of writings of his teacher in New Spain, the French Franciscan Juan Faucher. The preface of the resultant Itinerarium Catholicum is dated October 1573, and the book was published the following year in Seville. This practical guide for missionaries is unillustrated except for a lone woodcut of the crucifixion after the table of contents. However, the title is notable in that it reveals Valadés's appreciation for print, his desire to publish, and his access to book publishers and funding nearly immediately upon his arrival in Europe. Now, in contrast to the minimally illustrated Itinerarium, when Valadés set about crafting the Rhetorica Christiana, produced a few years later in Rome and Perugia, he was clearly thinking more about the power of images. As I mentioned, this book contains 27 prints, though of notably varying originality and quality. Many of these prints are clearly etchings. One can discern the sketch-like wavery quality of the lines produced by the etching needle. Etchings, to remind us all, though I probably don't need to remind all you, but maybe I do, are produced by scratching lines into a metal plate covered with some sort of acid-resistant ground. And then you bathe the plate in acid so that the acid eats away at the scratched lines. The resultant grooves then have lines of even thickness and flexibility that closely resemble drawn lines. Now, in contrast, engraving requires the use of a burin, which is harder to manipulate and leaves a distinctive sort of tapering line. Only the first few prints in the Rhetorica are engraved. Some, including the oft-illustrated image of the Franciscan friar preaching to an indigenous audience, appear to be in mixed technique, but the majority of the illustrations are etched in their entirety, including several signed by the author himself, Valadés Fechet. Etching and engraving are both intaglio printing techniques, in contrast to the relief printing of the book's text or the earlier woodcut we saw in the Itinerarium. This meant the illustrated pages of the Rhetorica had to be printed twice, once with the letterpress for text, and then subsequently run through a roller press for the images, a laborious and costly additional step in the book's production. Here we can see how the copper plate was slightly misaligned when the text page went through its second printing. But what does it matter if this plate was engraved or if it was etched? Well, for starters, it was very unusual for books to be illustrated with etchings in 1579. When Valadés arranged to have his book printed in Rome in the later 1570s, the dominant mode of book illustration was woodcut, which saved the cost of a second printing, or books were furnished with engravings. For example, the same year that the Rhetorica Christiana was published, a rival Roman missionary order, the Benedictines, published an illustrated life of Saint Benedict with 50 engraved illustrations. While etching as a print medium was nearly 80 years old by the time the Rhetorica was published, etchings had just begun to be used in book illustrations in European publishing centers like Lyon, Venice, and Antwerp, and then even then only sporadically. In the 1570s in Rome, etchings were instead being published as single sheet prints, but were not, to my knowledge, being broadly used in book illustration. Etching was used for the production of maps and views, images of ruins and ceremonies. Etienne Duperrac was highly sought after for his etched antiquarian views of Rome, but the artist returned to his native France around 1578, so the very moment the book, the Rhetorica, is being published. Now, there are indications that Valadés initially wanted the book illustrated with engravings, which would have been in keeping with the status quo of Roman book publishing. The text printed in Rome has included key blanked spaces that are keyed to the size of copper plates, which must have already been cut to size. Some of the first prints in the Rhetorica are engraved, but executed rather stiffly with little to no texture and almost no atmosphere. Some are rather generic and suggesting they were either kind of directly recycled or reworked plates, or things that were, as you can see here, directly copied from existing printed models. When Valadés was recalled from Rome, it appears that he collected the pre-cut copper plates intended for insertion into the text of the Rhetorica, perhaps even recalling them from the engraver who was employed to illustrate to undertake the illustration program. He then took with him to Perugia the plates, the already printed text pages, and it seems the paper, as the same two watermarks appear in sections printed both in Rome and in Perugia. The fact he was able to do so and to continue the printing of the book despite the move suggests Valadés had considerable papal support and protection, although the removal from Rome did result in some errors of pagination and other errata noted in the final pages. It is this relocation, however, that seems to have precipitated a shift in the book's illustration program. Perhaps Valadés could not find an engraver in Perugia to complete the project. The specialist skill of using the burin meant that these artists were in high demand, and a significant program of engraved illustration required time. In contrast, etching was a relatively quick process and had a lower barrier to entry. That is, if you can draw, you can etch, as long as you've been taught how to properly prepare the plate and the acid solution. But was it Valadés who had the idea to create etched illustrations? And how did he come to learn of this technique? In contrast to the engraved cross-section of the mind I show here on upper left, where Valadés is described as inventor, 5 of the Retorica's etchings are signed fecit, suggesting this new mode of production also occasioned a shift in how Valadés conceived of himself as an author and creator. These prints signed made by Valadés include the famous scenes of Franciscans in the missionary field, the full page representation of the Mexica calendar, including Nahuatl glyphs, and a larger fold-out sheet depicting Amerindian life before Spanish invasion. There are also a number of smaller, entirely etched plates, integral to the text, that have borders with the 3 knots of the Franciscan corded belt. And this is in contrast to those plates that appear to be fully or partially engraved, have much different, more elaborate borders, which suggests these 2 things were produced in separate campaigns of illustration. I would therefore argue that Valadés, in addition to perhaps designing many of the book's other illustration, could also be the primary printmaker responsible for a number of these etchings. The recognition of etched illustration within the Retorica opens up a host of questions that have not been asked of this object and its author and maker due to the somewhat exclusive focus on the book's content and the author's ethnic identity. While not all of these questions can be answered here, interrogating the book's facture suggests a much more complex biography for this object. Firstly, where could Valadés have learned to etch? It certainly wasn't, as most scholars have assumed regarding his presumed ability to engrave, in New Spain, where there is no evidence of locally produced intaglio printmaking before 1600. However, while it's unlikely Valadés learned the highly specialized skill of engraving while training to be a priest, he was probably instructed in drawing, and he would have used this skill when working as a missionary. In the Retorica, Valadés describes and illustrates how priests used canvases to explain the gospel to the local populace. Surviving manuscripts of pictorial catechisms also attest to this practice. Given the brevity of his 1572 trip to France and the lack of illustration in the 1574 Itinerarium published in Seville, it seems most probable that Valadés learned to etch while living in Italy. But Italian etching in the 1570s was mostly concentrated in northern Italy and was largely practiced further south by French or Netherlandish émigrés like Duperrac. Valadés's use of this technique then puts him in the orbit of highly skilled immigrant artists, antiquarian printmakers, and publishers in Rome, suggesting a particularized social network in which the artist and author needs to be resituated. If Valadés learned to etch in Rome, how did these etchings come to be printed in Perugia and by a publisher with no history of producing intaglio illustrations? As a papal territory, Perugia was linked to Rome, and it was itself home to a university, an important Jesuit collegio, as well as literary academies and an academy of disegno. The Retorica's publisher, Pietro Giacomo Petrucci, began publishing books in the Umbrian city in 1567, and his shop was responsible for a number of music books, scholarly texts, and legal treatises. But I have found no other book published by Petrucci that includes any intaglio printing, neither engraving nor etching. So Petrucci, crucially, would have had to borrow the use of a roller press to complete the printing of the Retorica, further evidence that the illustration program was of singular importance to the project, despite the additional labor and cost. Now recall that Valadés was supposedly in exile in Perugia and under house arrest, yet he was able to leave Rome with considerable quantity of printed pages, reams of paper, and copper plates in various states of completion. Unbelievably, he just transported all of this material to Perugia, employed a printer, found a roller press to use in order to complete the Retorica within approximately a year. So it's an incredibly fast production. Who paid for this extraordinary effort? Valadés's sudden political misfortune seems to not have impeded the book's production, despite the fact these considerable obstacles of shipping, cost, access to technical skills and facilities. The question of patronage, rather inexplicably, has almost entirely been ignored in the study of the Retorica. A scholarly focus, as I've said, so thoroughly trained, instead it's on seemingly sui generis pictures. Yet our analysis of the book and its illustrations shifts when one considers the various possibilities. Was this a publication paid for by the Pope, by the Franciscan order, or by some unknown wealthy political or ecclesiastical backer? The Papal Dedication is relatively standard for a title produced in the Papal States, and the book's front matter is silent on the subject of patronage. There's the suggestion in Valadés's preface that he showed the Pope some of the illustrations, this is the bit that I've underlined here, in advance of publication, but the material history of this book's production must have necessitated much more active support and capital outlay than simple papal approval. There's also some evidence that Valadés expanded the illustration program for the Retorica once he was forced to move from Perugia to Perugia. There are a number of inserted full-page images that fall outside the pagination of the text, such as the famous illustration of the Mexica or Aztec calendar. Now, in 1577, the very year that Valadés was recalled from his post as Procurator General for the Spanish territories, Philip II also wrote to Valadés's Franciscan brother in New Spain, Bernardino de Sahagún, who had spent decades compiling manuscripts on pre-Hispanic customs and beliefs. The Spanish king ordered Sahagún to surrender his writings, and the surviving material is now known as the Florentine Codex. The writings of another Franciscan, Jerónimo de Mendieta, would also remain unpublished until the 19th century. Valadés's Retórica Cristiana, with its illustrations of indigenous customs and its replication of modes of pre-contact Central Mexican figuration, thus represents a singular escape from a renewed Spanish policy of control over the recording and depiction of pre-Hispanic customs. As a printed product, it exceeded the strict viewing conditions imposed upon related Franciscan texts, which were produced in manuscript and remained in private hands. 3 of the Retórica's prints, a scene illustrating gruesome punishment for adultery, an image of the indigenous and various sort of animals amongst the elect, and a depiction of Christ's crucifixion with indigenous onlookers are omitted in some surviving editions of the Retórica, suggesting these scenes were excised by scrupulous owners or booksellers and may have been seen as particularly controversial. Now, that is not to cast Valadés as a renegade committed to impartial observation or unbiased access to events in the viceroyalties. But Valadés certainly recognized the desire for knowledge about the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and he sought to exploit this epistemic motivation, which was more than simple curiosity or wonder, but in fact central to the project of colonial control, as the images furnish proof of Amerindian barbarity and idolatry, and thus validated Spanish territorial and papal ecclesiastical expansion. The largest image in the Retórica is a fold-out etching of so-called Mexican idolatries that took place prior to the Spanish invasion. The sketch-like technique of etching conveys the immediacy of sort of lived or witnessed experience, but Valadés's illustration also conflates Mexica practices with other pre-contact Amerindian customs to create a fictional indigenous world. Valadés's scene of Franciscan evangelization drew upon already familiar visual tropes of the peaceful indigenous subject, idealizing the author's experience as a missionary. The variations within the illustration program and surviving copies indicate that some of these images were nevertheless seen as problematic, and like the book's own complex production history, suggest how studying the Retórica Cristiana as an object opens up a consideration of potential tensions between the Franciscans and the Pope, conflicts between papal and Spanish imperial authority around 1579, exceeding the dominant scholarly fixation on the content rather than the context of the book's images. The term foul biting refers to the unintentional marks left by acid during the etching process. Fluid and unpredictable, these marks result where the acid-stopping ground has been compromised, often at the corners of the plates, as seen here. In what time that remains, I'd like to suggest that the presence of etching in this book represents a similar kind of escape from the methodological blinders imposed by previous scholarship on this object, places where the actual object reveals a much more complex negotiation of identity and facture. The book's etchings make use of Nawa glyphs, or in several instances, use forms evocative of them, such as these bundled seated figures, or the use of speech scrolls for secular rulers. This mixing of Mesoamerican and European modes of representation, as Tom Cummins first noted, establishes the fiction of the image as a neutral site for cross-cultural exchange. But of course, images are not and have never been a universal language. Pictorial spaces are one of the primary sites of interaction between visualities. These prints, like those used by missionaries in New Spain, were intended to produce a common visuality amongst believers, but they also forced a recognition that there are alternative ways of seeing, that images could be freighted with supplemental meanings, valences resistant to direct translation. Valadés acknowledges this in his etched calendar, an illustration that goes unglossed in the Latin text, as the author says only that the calendar ought to be explained in the Mexican language and not in Latin. Nevertheless, the calendar's inclusion signals Valadés's awareness that such an image, even without textual explanation, would be understood by European readers at the very moment of the Gregorian calendar reforms in a very different way than seen and understood in New Spain. The etched line rhetorically assists the artist-author's claims to direct knowledge of the Mexica, but also opens up the possibility of multiple interpretations and indeed of illegibility, and the print is extremely difficult to read. Cummins' key insight regarding Valadés's Rhetorica Cristiana, that the colonial project relied on establishing the, quote, shared pictorial space of truth, can be turned back upon the art historical interpretation of this book itself. In seeing these prints as illustrative rather than constitutive, focusing on their representational features, identifying their iconographic models and the cultural practices they depict, but diminishing their epistemological and ontological claims as images, scholars studying this book have bought into a related kind of pictorial fiction, an assumption that print is merely reproductive. This leads to a kind of epistemic collapse, where the image is only discussed in terms of content, dissected and parsed for indigeneity, rather than recognizing it as one of the earliest books published, illustrated with engraved etchings, a milestone in the history of book illustration. In doing so, previous scholars of the Rhetorica have mirrored and reenacted Valadés's rhetorical move, his insistence that the Mexica calendar ought to be glossed in a Mexican language rather than Latin. Questions of facture offer not only a reassessment of basic questions about this book, its patronage, viewership, and context for its production, but also reveals our disciplines, that is, art history's structural weaknesses when faced with the study of such objects, namely the desire for mestizo subjects and objects, the relative art historical blindness to print technologies, and a concomitant assumption of print's role as a primarily reproductive medium if it's not made by a European peintre gravure. The oft-repeated claims about Valadés's racial identity make the Rhetorica a, quote, mestizo image, one neatly caught between two supposedly stable identities, Spanish and indigenous. This focus on mestizaje denies the modernity of presumed non-European subjects, reinforcing the colonial ethnographic gaze inculcated in images like those within the Rhetorica. The import of racialist language like mestizo to describe art objects produced within or reflecting upon transcultural spaces reveals a methodological failure to escape colonial frameworks, such as the denial of coevalness, which underpin the production of an exotic other. Valadés, likely born in Spain but raised and educated in the Americas, drew upon a knowledge of print forged in both the missionary spaces of central Mexico and amongst cutting-edge printmakers in Rome. The granularity of etching disturbs the abstraction of this book as exotica or as missionary icon, two representative objects for the colonial encounter. the foul bite, the errant acid, prompts another view, forcing a recognition of these prints not as dematerialized, but in the words of Jennifer Roberts, differently materialized. Etching is a process quite literally produced by decay and gestural deferral. The etched line, while evocative of the hand, is in fact directly produced by acid. Foul biting is evidence of the ontological conditions of the print, of how a plate was submerged and pulled out of acid by a particular hand at a singular moment in time. I've suggested here that the foul bite reminds us of the contingent nature of artistic making, the necessity of interrogating the material qualities of the printed image, attending to the facet as well as the invenit, in Valadés's work as an author and maybe an artist. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was really wonderful. I think together these two talks give us a lot of material to discuss. But first, I just want to acknowledge all of the many friends and colleagues who I see on my list, and once again offer, as Andrew Marl did previously, the sentiment that I wish we were all together, but of course we wouldn't really be all together in real life. So it's great to be here together in Zoom in any case. So I think we have lots to talk about. I think what we'll do is start with our panel, and then we'll move to the general Q&A. So those of you who are in the panel here, if you have questions, you can simply either raise your actual hand or raise your mechanical hand and ask a question. And those of you who are in the audience can use the Q&A function, and I will get to those eventually. So we're supposed to stop at 7:30, but I am feeling like there might be a little more discussion going. So if that happens, those of you who do have to leave at 7:30 are obviously free to go on your way, but we will remain here until such time as we feel that this particular discussion has been exhausted. So where do we begin? I think that the conjunction of these two talks, we begin with me, of course. I'll start and people can formulate their questions. The conjunction of these two talks, both of which were engaged with the material book on a number of dimensions, are very, very engaging. And I wonder, this is a question that is motivated to a certain extent by some of my own work. Have you both looked at multiple copies of these printed books? You know, I mean, I can't recommend enough looking at as many copies as you can possibly get your mitts on, or even if they're your eyes from Google Books, because these books they're very complicated and they're not all the same. And they have kind of personalities, and they tell you things about them. And I think that's one of the most wonderful aspects of looking at early modern printed books, and looking at them as books, not just as information or just as texts, the way sometimes they are treated. So let me just throw that out there to both of you. And then in the meantime, I'm sure there will be questions that will be formulated.
Yeah, I could just start off by saying that I actually went about this project thinking about the customization of the books, and that was one of the driving forces behind my research initially. And there are tons of them online, which is great. So you can really leaf through them online. And I know there's somebody out there, perhaps actually here today, who is researching the different editions of the books. And so we'll hopefully know more soon, especially of the 1646 one. But I think that's crucial. We can't understand these early publications without looking at multiple editions or thinking about why particularly with atlases, they're ordered in different ways. Probably not so much the case with Valadés. But I'd be curious to know if they are different. Yeah,
they are different. So not only is that, I showed the 3 images that aren't in our copy here at Tulane, but I think those are not in the copy in Salamanca also, from what I'm gathering from various library descriptions. Some of the questions that I have are really about looking at the way that the illustrations are inserted into the text. So I really need to get in there and look at quire structure, which is they appear to be in the 2 that I've looked at closely. So the Getty, which I looked at in January, right before, And then the one that happens to be in the library that I can access appear to be very different. Like the illustrations are in different places, not totally different places. Obviously the ones that are integral to the text are there, but there's a number of those full page illustrations are in totally different places. So there, yes, there's a lot of variety, and I'm very much looking forward. I can do like a round trip of seeing like 4 of them if I go up to New York. So I'm hoping to do that.
Great, let's hope. I said Barbara Mundy, welcome.
Thank you. These are such terrific talks, and Leah, I'm so glad to hear this iteration of this talk. And Stephanie, you've really thrown such light on a book which is just canonical for understanding 16th century Mexico, and so few people have been able to look at it the way that you've looked at it. So it's absolutely illuminating. I wanted to address the afterlives of these books. Can you talk about what happened to them, how they got, what were there, did other authors pick up their imagery as an indication of their publics and their receptions? And I'm also struck by the copies of the Valadés that I've looked at have always been in absolutely sterling condition. So I wonder if you could comment on that as part of the afterlife of the book.
I can just say quickly that there really is not much out there on the reception of this enormous book that took 40 years to make. It's very troubling. And if you think of other atlases produced in the same period, like Blau and it's, other Dutch atlases, this does not have the life that those did. And there's a few mentions of it here and there, but and Dudley is clearly not a household name. So it's interesting. It doesn't really have a very exciting afterlife, and I'm not sure exactly why that is. So something to think about more.
Great, thanks. I have Claudia Swan. Claudia.
Hi, thank you. Those were wonderful papers, and Leah, it was great I've seen, you showed me those books in the Newberry, so it was really great to hear you talk about that. I was wondering about the conditions. So this is the inverse of Barbara Mundy's question, the conditions of the production, which of course, Stephanie, you've talked a lot about, but specifically the presses on which they were printed. And the thing about etching, which, I mean, it's just fabulous that you've revealed that these are etchings, and that does, of course, change everything. I just wondered if anybody knew, I mean, of course, in the Dutch world in the 17th century, etching presses were domestic implements. I just wondered whether anybody knows more about this, or whether you've looked into this, whether actually having an etching press might not have been as extraordinary as having a full engraving press in the home, that certainly, or having access to one. Whether this might have been the fact that it's etched might be a symptom of its having to have been produced domestically. And similarly, or a similar question for Leah, or related question, is where did Dudley actually print the volume? Do you know? I mean, was it at the court or?
I'll go first, and I'll also talk to Barbara's questions. So I'll do a bunch, and then I'll hand it to Leah. In terms of the presses, that's something that I think is the next piece for this. I need to figure out if anyone knows how many roller presses are in Perugia in 1578. That'd be really good information to have. I'm well outside of my ken there. So I'm trying to figure out, what other, there's, a number of publishers that are active in the city and the region. So trying to figure out who has roller press. I mean, it's very common for publishers to work with colleagues to borrow a press, a roller press for projects. It was unusual to me that this publisher had never, and it is, to my knowledge, has no other projects that he has used a roller press for. So somebody facilitated that, funded that, and whether that had meant that those pages had to be shipped out of Peru. I mean, that's another sort of set of questions. But that's something I need to actually research. And really do some digging, which hopefully will be possible in the nearest future. Barbara's question about afterlives and reception and condition. by the end of the 18th century, or not even the end, the like early booksellers refer to this book already as a thing that is a valuable object and notable for its illustrations. So I think it's immediately has a pretty elite audience and is not like in massive circulation. I don't know really what the edition, like the print run is, but I think it's not massive, and I don't think that I think it's the condition that you speak of, I think speaks to the fact that it was a kind of valuable object. I've seen some kind of dirty ones, but like, I think they, as you're right, they tend to be pretty well preserved.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have a question from Aaron Hyman.
I have a question for Stephanie, although it comes out of Leah's sort of discussion and Dudley's insistence on the eyewitness nature of his work. And Stephanie, it seems like you're pushing toward a claim that the etching offers the images a kind of eyewitness status because of their relationship to drawing, and that there's a kind of a rhetoric of the line that's at play here. And also toward the idea that etching in this moment, because of the early inclusion of etching in books, is a kind of cosmopolitan gesture on the part of Valadés. And I'm wondering, this for me opened up the question of who would have understood those gestures, would have understood etching as being both kind of having an eyewitness potential because of the indexicality it offers to the author's hand, and who would have understood it as cosmopolitan. You point to this sort of kind of tight-knit cosmopolitan network of mostly immigrant printmakers. So it feels to me that your insistence on production also opens up a related question of audience, and I think in this case, audiences. But who are the people that could really understand the sophistication of the claims at the material and technical level, do you think? If you had to sort of gesture, I know this is sort of the beginning of the project for you, but if you had to start guessing towards an answer to that, where would you be going?
Well, I mean, I think that it's also, I think that if he learns that all these things kind of interlap, right? The production history, the audience, the question of like who buys it, back to Barbara's question, what state is it in? That I think it's probably an audience that appreciates and recognizes etchings, I think is at least one subset of that audience. Now, I'm not saying, there's going to be people who, it's a book on rhetoric. So you're already talking about a kind of educated audience that's interested in kind of classical education. So that I think already self-selects yourself into exactly who we're talking about when we're talking about early print collecting, right? So that's already the same group, sort of. So I think they would have recognized, at least some people, I think, would have recognized etching distinctively. Rather not they were able to like parse the mixed technique. I don't think so, but I think the fact that these prints do distinctly look different than even the engraved books in the same book, in the same volume. And part of that atmospheric, particularly those scenes of the, Valadés amongst the natives, right, that are like really about that kind of claim to observation, and the way that these included all these different plants and labeled them in the big famous image of the pre-Hispanic customs. I think all of that is about a claim to witness. That is similar, a different, but it's related vocabulary to the claim to witness in the antiquarian prints, right? Which is about witness and sort of memory of something that you've seen. So I think that they're related, but I think I have a lot more work to sort of do to think about all the different all the different versions of it, how early we know any of the provenance or anything. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. I think it just opens up potentially different registers of audience for you in addition to thinking about the production history, but it's completely changing the way we're thinking about this object. So amazing work.
Thank you. Great. So I'm just going in the order that these questions were received, and I should just tell everybody who's watching this that there are 100 people here, which is fantastic. But it means that if you asked a question, we just might not have a chance to answer it. So the next question I have in order is my colleague Ivan Gaskell.
Thanks, Deborah. These are really fascinating papers. I enjoyed them very much. I particularly value your attention to the specific physical characteristics of individual books and their parts. I think that's really great. But as you both know, Bard Graduate Center is an interdisciplinary institution. It's not an art history institution. And I'm an historian, not an art historian. I do a bit of art history on the side, but I'm an historian. And so I put people before things. So my question is about people, about Valadés and Dudley. And it's about status. And I'm wondering to what extent both of them might have been motivated by an overriding concern with their individual status. And Valadés obviously has a problem. He's been in a really good position, and then he gets chucked out and off to Perugia. My God, who wants to go to Perugia? And I think you said, Stephanie, that he's under house arrest. That is a real horror for him. Dudley is desperate to be recognized as Earl of Warwick and Earl of Leicester. He tries to get the emperor to recognize him by his grandfather's title of Duke of Northumberland. This is an obsession with him. And as you know, the Star Chamber process goes totally against him. His mother's written evidence is chucked out. James I says basically, forget it. And so I'm wondering whether the production of these things is really, it's about lots of things, of course, but what's the role of status, not just in the production of the books, but in these societies at that time, that people should be so concerned with the positions that they hold and that are denied to them. That's for both of you.
No, I think you have it. It's the heart of Dudley's project is his own identity, and this obsession with promoting his name, finding legitimacy, promoting himself in this way. It's really remarkable. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with your comments. And I mean, what's crazy is though it takes, a 700-page manuscript and 50 years of working on this publication involving so many people at the court to do it. And it just tells you a lot about the importance of the book at this time, of the atlas in particular. This is the first sea atlas. I think that is significant too. There's something innovative about his project. So I think it is something I should think about more, but it's very telling about the role of the book at this moment and its power to promote status.
So I've sort of taken an anti-biographical stance a little bit, but I do think, the whole question of how he's able to get it done relies on the fact that I think house arrest is like clearly not that punitive or not that controlling. Within a year or two, like 18 months, he's in Florence investigating, doing things for the Pope. So he seems to kind of get off and then has a lovely life in Italy for the rest of his life. It's also unclear if he really falls from grace from Philip II or if Philip II's mad at the order, mad at something else. He does seem to retain ties in Spain, is I think with the last document in his life is 1584, and he's commenting on the relative authenticity of relics for colleagues back in Spain. So he doesn't really, this fall, which is kind of a significant dismissal, doesn't really seem to impact his political sort of gadabout Italy life. But he does never return to New Spain, which is not nothing either.
Okay, great. Let's move quickly on to our next question, which is from Karen Kupperman.
Yeah, I think the Dudley book is really an antique by the time it's published, and the knowledge in it is really, I mean, he may emphasize his personal experience, but it's long been overtaken, I think, by more other publications. But one of the questions I wanted to ask, that this is something I've wanted to ask for a very long time, and that is when he has those images of naked Indians, and he says they're cruel, they're deformed, all this kind of stuff. Does he comment, no one seems to, on the fact that if they're naked, they are without sin? People only needed to wear clothes once they became sinful. And it's, you know, they're constantly talking about naked savages, but nobody ever puts these two things together, you know, in a way that I think they should have.
That's a big question. Dudley doesn't deal with this at all. And he does not speak of their nudity, unlike a lot of earlier sources that do, beginning with Columbus and Vespucci. At this point, that's not relevant at all. And maybe this is a good question for other people in the audience. I'm trying to think of other sources that do make this connection. It's a good point, but it's not by the time Dudley's working on this project, by the late 16th, early 17th century, it's no longer really relevant. The connection.
But he's still portraying them as naked.
They are dressed. They're not completely naked. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's of a concern at this point. I think
No, I think it was something that they preferred to dodge.
he's more interested in their the danger of the waters or their cannibalistic behaviors than thinking about their dress specifically. Or...
Right, well, I don't think we're going to resolve this evening.
No, no.
So our next question is from one of our students, Heath.
I just wanted to throw my sense in about Ivan's statement about gaining approval through publishing. This is added on. In the case of Dudley in particular, like the Medici has like a precedent of that. Like with Machiavelli, he wrote a book to get approval again after losing it. So I think that does have some base in that. But my main question was for Stephanie, because she seemed, and I think it's a really interesting way to think about it, etching and like learning to do etching being new technology and harder, like more unfamiliar. And I mean, the challenge of it, like the aquatint is the hard part, especially early on. I would imagine that would create a problem. But I would think that you might want to consider looking into armor making being a possible thing that he would have run across, maybe, just maybe, because there are other outlets for etching and engraving. And so maybe it's not necessarily directly from an art maker, but through an armory.
Well, I think the time that, by the time that Valadés this book is being made, you know, Vasari mentions, you know, the etchings, how you make etching solution. Cellini gives a recipe for it, I think. So it is well known, you know, how to do it later in abstraction, but I do think you would have needed somebody to kind of explain, you know, kind of walk you through it. And you could, again, the question of whether he's using a sort of salts and acid or nitric acid that was already kind of pre-bought is something that I'll have to look at more closely. But like that question of what, who he learned it from, I think is, I think it's most likely Rome, just in terms of where he is and how long he is there. And I think in that circumstance, it makes more sense to look to the kind of printmakers working for Lafrary, and that seems to be the same kinds of networks in terms of the orders, the kinds of intellectual ambitions. But thank you.
I do like the idea of the etching though. I have a lot that is very appealing, and I like your focus on it. It seems like a desperation to make it, like make this document. And there is something really alluring about that, like just the thought that he would just figure out how to do it himself because he wants it so badly. I like that. So I appreciate it a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Heath. Andrew, I see you have your mechanical hand raised.
I will defer to the other guests tonight.
Okay.
I was going to ask a similar question to Aaron's about the immediacy of the etching process as a form of indexical identification, and so on. And the one example I can think of comes from Nuremberg in the 1550s. It's the writing master Johannes Neuberger, who in his writing manuals, and actually Heath, we were discussing this last week, he changes from woodcuts to very self-consciously to etching because it was his own hand. And he's very explicit about it. And it's a very experimental book, printing on etching on carta lucida, with counterproofs and so forth. Very, very complex book, but he's very explicit about wanting to show off, in a sense, his own hand and not have it replicated, as it were, by woodcut. So that was my only, it does exist north of the Alps, very explicitly in the mid-16th century. I can't, alas, speak for Rome or Perugia.
Oh my, we have so many questions. Well, Paula Findlin, please.
Oh, so first, I just wanted to say as a general comment that I felt like the theme of tonight was something along the lines of, book and image making between worlds, right? And there was something extremely interesting about looking at these two case studies together. And as the conversation has gone on, that was my first thought. And then as the conversation has gone on, I started to think also that what we're talking about also is book improvisation, right? We don't normally think about improvisation in the making of books, but I think both of you have really demonstrated that in very different ways. And especially, Stephanie, as you say, I'm not going to be able to look at those images the same way again after listening to you talk about it. So thank you so much for that. So Lia, of course, I know Lia's world better, right? And so I wanted to just offer a few sort of thoughts. I completely agree with this idea that this is New World antiquarianism as well as an utterly personal project, right, by the end. But I wonder too, in a way of, so then what does that mean in this particular context, right? Because when it starts out, it seems like he wants to be the Raleigh of Florence, right? He's naming islands after himself and, all this, stuff, right? It's all about him, and it still is all about him by the end. But isn't he, like Lia, isn't he also of this whole generation of kind of the textual non finito in early to mid 17th century Florence? Like, think of, does he intersect with, he must, with Antonio Nardi, for instance, whose Scene Toscane is even larger than this. It's like it's 2,000 pages. It's the endless, never published book that's supposed to do everything, like every conversation that's supposed to happen about any aspect of art and knowledge, all embodied in this manuscript at the National Library, and so there is something about, about the way in which the unfinished, and yet of course this one does exit in this kind of odd way. But so one is thinking about, to what extent are you able to really reconstruct what his network is? Because of course, as time goes on, who he was in England may matter to him, but it certainly doesn't matter to the English. And to what degree, ultimately going back to this really interesting detail about Torricelli is, mio amico. What the hell does this mean, and in this moment? And maybe the most specific question I had is, to what extent should we see this as a story parallel to the similarly fraught, ultimately antiquarian and complicated story of the publication of, the remnants of, the Francisco Hernandez Tesoro Mexicano in Rome, that is also trying to finish up in this exact same period after endless fits and starts. So I guess I sort of generally, like Ivan, I'm a historian, right? I'm generally inviting you to tell us, if you want, a little more about what you've started to understand about his context, that what's facilitating and continuing to make him think this will matter to who he is all these decades later,
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love this book, the idea of book improvisation too, which is the case, even though it's taking 40 some years to make it, it's still totally improvisational. It's so strange. But yeah, I'd love to dig into, learn more about his relationship to Torricelli, who was in his circle in Florence at this time. Another version of this talk is really about information overload, a la Anne Blair. And I only showed a fraction of this atlas today. There's so much more to it. And I have to give a shout out to Leslie Geddes, who's thinking more about the instruments and the shipbuilding and that aspect of the publication as well. There's just so much more to explore, and it's really overwhelming. And like you said, it is this, and I had conversations with Brian also about the Tesoro Mexicano and its relation to that and to other publications at this time that are just trying to compile, even Sahagún's project, which is massive 3 volumes, that's in Florence at the time. You know, I don't think it's something to think about as well. So yeah, I think there's so much more to do here. And I'm trying to grapple with how much I want to take on. And I think there's tons of material at the archives still, and this manuscript in Munich, and much to study to learn more about his circle for sure. But definitely.
Okay, thank you both. Susan Dackerman.
I want to add my praise to the 2 talks. They were so good and so sound and related in so many interesting and not necessarily spoken ways, but the threads are so clear. I want to go back to the materiality of production, if you don't mind, for just a few moments. I am really interested in the way, I can't get it out of my head, the movement in Stephanie's description of the plates in the paper and the materials of production from Rome to Perugia. I mean, moving those copper plates had to be a very delicate business. We all know copper is soft, and any mark on the surface of those plates is, of course, going to show up in the printing. So the use of copper in that instance, I think, is really interesting. And I think it's also, Lia, doesn't the engraver of the plates in your book talk about how many, didn't he use like 2 tons of copper or some, isn't that part of?
Yeah, he cites an enormous amount of copper, the 12 years it takes. And these are, you know, giant plates and pages of plates. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in the materiality and the rhetoric around copper in the instance of these 2 books that are about this relationship between the New World and the Old World, especially in the century after which Central Europe has used up a lot of its copper ore and supplies for making copper plates. So I wonder if either one of you have a comment on copper and its use in mining and trade and how it plays into your ideas. In Stephanie's book, you know, I think, of course, the choice of etching is so important. I mean, any artist makes those choices so consciously, and there's so much meaning, I think, embedded in those choices. And you know, engraving is a mechanical technique, whereas etching, one has to know so much about the materiality of copper and how it's going to be affected in the production process. So Stephanie, I think your argument is really interesting. So I'm just interested in hearing what you have to say about these references to copper in both texts.
Well, I'm happy to start, Leah, if you want. I mean, I think I'm kind of start at the end there about the comment about knowing the materials with etching. I mean, and you can see the variation. I mean, I tried to show you a lot of the prints from the book because they are so varied, and a lot of it has to do with how well bitten they are. So some of them are really dark, and some of them are really silvery and light. You know, the kind of mission complex one is really a light lightly done, compared to some of the small inset ones, which are really, really dark. And that might have something to do both with, you know, different hands being at work, but also I just think with experiments with the material that he's trying to work out. Some have a lot of tone left on the plate. Like I think there is just a real sense of someone improvising, right? Like figuring out how this stuff is going to work. And I think your point about the fragility of copper, those engraved, I think almost all of the engraved plates really have some etching on them because they had to be corrected or dealt with. And I didn't really get into that, but the more I look at them, all I see is etching, like all everywhere. Yeah, thank you.
So we have a question I see from Madeline Villon. Madeline, are you there?
I'm here. Hi. And also just want to chime in and say hi, Lia. Hi, Stephanie. Some really amazing papers. Thank you so much. And I don't want to take too much more time because I realize that we're really towards the end of our time here. But I actually had a question primarily actually for you, Lia. It was about the title of the book, which I think is really intriguing, this Arcano, right? And I was just wondering what that tells us maybe about the identity of this book. And it feels like, I mean, so many of these sort of travel books are about discovery, but this is about secrets, which seems to jive more with sort of ideas about sort of artisanal ideas even, or sort of, and I just wonder what you make of it and whether this title also appears in any of the sketchbooks, or whether and when it might have been, when the book might have received its name. Anyway, I'm just curious about it because I think that might also tell us something else perhaps about the ambitions of the book. Thank you.
That's a great question. And I think the secretness may not be so much about the maps and the coastlines, though there's, you know, a lot of novel information there, but maybe perhaps in the first volumes that relate to shipbuilding and instruments and such, so that perhaps the secrecy lies more there than in the cartography, but that's something to think about more. And I'll really have to comb through the text, which is so long, to try to find if he discusses this at all. I have not found it so far, but it could be lurking in there. I think there's so many secrets in this enormous text just because who can read it all? It's a great point, though. Thank you. I'll look into it.
There's a question from a potential question from Evie Lincoln. Do you want to ask your question? We're happy to have you. To be shy.
I don't have the hand raise function, so
okay. Well, that's okay.
No, I think I want to echo everybody. This is just really wonderful, and I think, you know, as I guess Heath said, you know, the people that I know of that are etching in Rome at the end of the century are also doing other things, you know, like fountain making or, you know, like camilographical, things like that. So it is possible that as a Franciscan, he was doing stuff that put him in touch with people who were doing small scale etching. But I also found with, you know, like working on Benedictines, that it's hard with religious orders to figure out, you know, how they're actually getting access to printing. And I'm thinking of Valadés here. So I was wondering, Stephanie, if you knew if Petrucci, is that the Perugian publisher's name? Does he have these presses? Because you said he doesn't do other things. So, but I often found people working with publishers and also people printing on the fly. And in terms of bringing plates, you know, Gysi's plates went north really early. And I mean, it's stunning how these big plates actually traveled around, you know, heavy, big plates. I mean, the people who wrote about it say on the backs of donkeys packed in oiled cloth, you know, boxes with oiled cloth. So, I mean, they did it, but it's mind-boggling, really is. So it's not really a question, just, you know, expanding, I guess, the world of a Franciscan missionary like him to the other kinds of non-artistic, non-publishing contacts that would have helped with delivery and trade and and even etching.
No, I would love to. I would like to do some archival work to figure some of this stuff out. Hopefully, some point soon. But yeah, no, I think Petrucci has, as far as I can tell, no other book where he's using a roller press. But he does music books, and he does other things that are kind of different. So maybe that's why he was the guy, or maybe again, it's like, you know, a friend of a friend, those kind of things, a brother of a brother. So hopefully you'll find some of these answers.
Yeah, it's a great image to think about those plates being carried by mules up into the hills of Perugia. I will say that they did carry around a lot of fragile stuff, glass and ceramics and very ripe fruit. I mean, all of these things were moving around. So it's not that surprising if you look at all the kinds of stuff that was being transported in the period. So we have many more questions from the so-called attendees who are people whose cameras are not on, and I'm sort of tempted to. They have some questions, quite specific questions. I would encourage them to perhaps write to the speakers to ask their questions. I'm sure the speakers would be happy to respond to them. I know that they're great questions and we'd be happy to discuss them, but it's now 7:48 and I'm mindful of the fact that Zoom, after a couple of hours, we begin to need to go and do something else. So let me once again thank, first of all, our two speakers, Lia and Stephanie, for these papers, which really did have incredibly interesting conjunctions that we honestly, Andrew and I, didn't even anticipate, but there they were. And thank all of the panelists for participating, and then thank the attendees who are watching from a distance, and hope that we will all be together soon again in real time and real space. So thank you all for coming, and see you all very soon, I hope. So
thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Okay.